The moment the private jet was grounded, everything Meghan Markle had been secretly building for months collapsed in silence, because according to whispers echoing through royal corridors and billionaire back channels, the Saudi crown princess had already made the call. And when she made that call, doors didn't just close, they vanished. This wasn't a public rejection, not at first, not something shouted in headlines or confirmed in statements, but a quiet, ruthless erasure executed with surgical precision behind palace walls, where reputations are decided with a single sentence and futures are erased without warning. Meghan believed she was flying into one of the most important meetings of her life, a private, off-record introduction to one of the Gulf's most powerful billionaire power brokers, a man whose investments could rebuild her brand, whose influence could open doors that Hollywood had begun quietly locking, whose endorsement could elevate her from scandal survivor to untouchable global figure again. But before she could even step onto Gulf soil, before the deal could be whispered into existence, before the cameras could capture her reinvention, someone far more powerful intervened, and the message delivered through elite diplomatic channels was chillingly clear: this meeting would not happen. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Because behind the polished public persona Meghan projected, the reinvention machine had already been activated in secret, quietly assembling a comeback strategy designed to restore her global influence after months of humiliating exposure and relentless scrutiny. And at the center of that strategy was a carefully arranged private audience with a Gulf billionaire whose name alone carried enough weight to reset her trajectory overnight. This wasn't just about money, it was about legitimacy, about access, about proving she still belonged among the world's most powerful elites, and insiders say the meeting had been months in the making, facilitated through discreet intermediaries who specialized in introducing fallen celebrities too, powerful benefactors seeking influence, visibility, or strategic alliances. The plan was simple but dangerously ambitious. Meghan would enter the Gulf quietly, meet the billionaire privately aboard his ultra-secure estate compound, and emerge weeks later with a renewed image, a revitalized brand partnership, and a powerful narrative that she had been embraced, not rejected, by one of the most exclusive elite circles on earth. But the crown princess had already been watching, already aware, already informed by intelligence networks that operated far beyond public visibility, and the moment Meghan's name surfaced in connection with the meeting, everything shifted. That phrase, the one that would ripple through diplomatic circles like a warning flare, had already placed Meghan under quiet scrutiny. Because when she declared that she could have been a Middle Eastern princess, she wasn't just speaking casually, she was signaling ambition, positioning herself as someone who still believed she could access royal power structures beyond Britain, someone who believed she could ascend again through influence rather than inheritance. And that declaration didn't go unnoticed, especially not in regions where royal titles weren't branding tools but sacred hierarchies protected by centuries of tradition, and insiders say that moment became the turning point. The moment Meghan transitioned from a tolerated outsider to a monitored liability. Behind the scenes, preparations for her Gulf entry had already been moving forward at astonishing speed. Private travel arrangements secured, luxury accommodations quietly reserved under alias names, security teams briefed without revealing the full scope of her visit, and a confidential meeting, schedule built around a single high-stakes encounter that promised to redefine her future. Those close to Meghan say she believed this meeting would restore everything she had lost: the influence, the access, the protection, the validation that she still belonged in rooms where power was negotiated and fortunes were shaped. But while she was planning her return, powerful figures within the Gulf were reviewing her past, examining her controversies, analyzing her recent diplomatic fallout, and questioning whether aligning with her would invite prestige or chaos. That line, once spoken in private, had escaped containment and spread through elite networks faster than anyone anticipated. And within days, it had reached individuals whose approval or rejection could determine Meghan's fate without explanation or negotiation. To some, it sounded like ambition, but to others, it sounded like entitlement. And in royal systems built on loyalty, humility, and controlled access, entitlement wasn't just unattractive, it was dangerous. Because power in those circles wasn't granted to those who demanded it, it was reserved for those who understood its boundaries, and Meghan's perceived willingness to claim proximity to royal authority without invitation triggered quiet alarm among those responsible for protecting those boundaries. By the time her travel window approached, the decision had already been made, though Meghan herself reportedly had no idea, continuing preparations under the assumption that her reinvention was still within reach, unaware that behind closed doors, conversations were unfolding that would permanently alter her trajectory. The crown princess, informed of the proposed meeting and the billionaire's potential involvement, government reportedly intervened through trusted diplomatic intermediaries, issuing a quiet but unmistakable directive that Meghan was not to be granted access, not to be introduced, not to be legitimized through association with Gulf elite structures. The entry restrictions that followed were interpreted by insiders as more than procedural decisions. They were signals, warnings communicated through action rather than explanation, reminders that access to elite circles wasn't guaranteed by fame or ambition alone, and once denied, it wasn't easily regained. Suddenly, the carefully orchestrated meeting evaporated, the billionaire withdrew without explanation, intermediaries stopped responding, and the pathway Meghan had been counting on simply disappeared, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a silence more devastating than public rejection. Because in elite power structures, silence isn't absence, it's verdict, and when doors close without explanation, the message is understood without needing to be spoken aloud. Meghan's team reportedly scrambled to salvage the situation, reaching out through alternative channels, attempting to reschedule introductions, exploring new alliances, but insiders say every attempt was met with the same quiet resistance, the same invisible barrier that had already been established. That statement, once dismissed as distant diplomatic commentary, now carried devastating new meaning, because it wasn't just denying her past ambitions, it was defining her future limitations, establishing a boundary that she couldn't negotiate her way across, couldn't charm her way through, couldn't rebrand her way beyond. The billionaire meeting had represented more than opportunity. It represented redemption, proof that she still possessed the influence to command elite attention, but with that opportunity erased, Meghan was forced to confront a reality she hadn't anticipated, a reality where power didn't just abandon you loudly, it abandoned you quietly, leaving no evidence behind except the opportunities that never happened. And somewhere behind palace walls, where decisions are made without public explanation, where influence operates without visibility, where reputations rise and fall without warning, the intervention had already achieved its purpose, not by humiliating Meghan publicly, but by ensuring she never reached the room where her reinvention could begin. The most terrifying part wasn't the rejection itself, it was how flawlessly it erased her without confrontation, without argument, without leaving behind anything she could fight, because Meghan never received a formal cancellation, never heard a direct no, never saw the face of the person who had, stopped her ascent mid-flight, and yet suddenly the billionaire stopped responding. The intermediaries who had once spoken with urgency and excitement fell into unnatural silence, and the carefully arranged pathway that had been constructed with such precision simply dissolved as if it had never existed. This wasn't an accident, and insiders close to elite Gulf networks began whispering the same explanation over and over again, that when the Saudi crown princess intervenes, she doesn't negotiate outcomes, she defines them, and once she defines them, the outcome becomes reality before anyone realizes it has changed. Meghan's arrival had been intended as the first step in a new chapter, the quiet beginning of her reintegration into circles of immense wealth and power, but instead she found herself trapped in a vacuum, suspended between the future she had expected and the reality she was now forced to confront, a reality where doors closed without sound and alliances evaporated without confrontation. Because this wasn't just about a meeting, it was about a narrative she had spent years constructing, the story of a woman who could survive rejection, reinvent herself, and emerge stronger each time she was underestimated. And the Gulf meeting had been designed to reinforce that narrative with visible proof that despite the scandals, despite the Yacht revelations resurfacing, despite the growing skepticism surrounding her carefully curated origin story, she still possessed the ability to attract the attention of the world's most powerful figures. But now that narrative had been interrupted, destabilized by an invisible force she couldn't confront publicly without acknowledging the very rejection she had hoped to conceal. And that silence became its own form of exposure, because the absence of her anticipated Gulf reappearance spoke louder than any official announcement ever could. Those images had already done damage far deeper than public embarrassment, because within elite circles, those photographs weren't viewed as glamorous memories but as records, evidence of past associations, introductions, and relationships that carried implications far beyond aesthetics. And when those images resurfaced just weeks before her planned meeting, they didn't just remind people of her past, they triggered renewed scrutiny among individuals whose decisions were guided not by emotion but by risk assessment. Because aligning with Meghan was no longer a neutral decision, it had become a calculated gamble, one that could invite controversy, scrutiny, and diplomatic complications, and for those whose power depended on stability and discretion, controversy wasn't currency, it was liability. Insiders say the billionaire himself had initially shown interest, intrigued by the possibility of introducing Meghan into carefully controlled philanthropic and commercial ventures designed to expand influence across Western and Middle Eastern audiences, but interest is fragile in environments governed by hierarchy. And once signals began emerging from royal channels that Meghan's presence was unwelcome, that interest reportedly transformed into distance almost overnight. Calls stopped being returned, confirmations became vague, and then came the final silence, the unmistakable silence that insiders recognize as the ultimate indicator that the decision had already been made somewhere far beyond Meghan's reach. What had been intended as strategic mystique, a calculated reminder of her access to elite environments, had backfired catastrophically, transforming from a symbol of influence into a symbol of vulnerability. Because instead of elevating her image, the Yacht revelations had invited questions she couldn't answer publicly. Questions about how she gained access, who facilitated those introductions, and what those associations meant within the rigid social structure she was now attempting to re-enter. And those questions didn't just exist in public gossip forums, they existed in private royal briefings, in conversations between advisors whose responsibility was to protect institutional credibility above all else. Because the Crown Princess's alleged intervention wasn't simply a reaction, it was a preventative measure, a decision made to preserve the integrity of royal networks by ensuring that association remained controlled, selective, and protected from external influence. And when that decision was made, it triggered a cascade effect far beyond the cancellation of a single meeting, because in elite ecosystems, signals from the top ripple outward instantly, influencing decisions across financial, diplomatic, and social structures simultaneously, ensuring alignment, without requiring explanation. That silence became the most revealing development of all, because Meghan had built her public identity around speaking, defending, correcting, and reshaping narratives in real time, and yet now, faced with the rejection she couldn't confront directly, she said nothing, and that nothingness spoke volumes to observers who understood how power truly operates. Because when someone accustomed to controlling their narrative suddenly loses the ability to respond, it signals something far more devastating than public criticism. It signals loss of leverage. Behind closed doors, insiders say Meghan's inner circle began reassessing everything, questioning whether her global reinvention strategy had underestimated the influence of individuals who operated beyond media visibility, individuals whose decisions weren't influenced by public sympathy or celebrity status, but by long-term institutional priorities. Because in those environments, fame doesn't grant access, access grants access, and once access is denied, there is no negotiation process, no appeal mechanism, no redemption campaign capable of reversing the decision. That was the true consequence of what had happened, not just the loss of a meeting, but the message it sent to everyone else watching. Every billionaire, every investor, every elite gatekeeper evaluating whether association with Meghan would elevate their status or complicate it. Because power doesn't operate in isolation, it operates through perception. And once perception shifts, it alters behavior across entire networks simultaneously. Suddenly, opportunities that might have existed quietly began evaporating before they could materialize, invitations were reconsidered before they could be extended, and Meghan's anticipated reinvention began unraveling before it could even be announced. And perhaps the most devastating reality wasn't that she had been publicly humiliated, but that she hadn't been publicly acknowledged at all. Because public rejection can be confronted, explained, reframed, but silent rejection leaves no opponent to confront, no statement to dispute, no narrative to reclaim. It leaves only absence, only unanswered questions, only the quiet realization that somewhere beyond visibility, a decision had already been made about her future. Because in the end, Meghan hadn't been stopped by scandal alone, or by public opinion, or even by the billionaire's hesitation. She had been stopped by something far more powerful, something that didn't operate through headlines or interviews, but through influence so absolute it didn't require explanation. And once that influence had spoken, the meeting didn't just collapse, it ceased to exist, erased from the future she had already begun to imagine, leaving behind nothing but silence, speculation, and the unmistakable understanding that in the world she had tried to re-enter, acceptance wasn't something she could demand, it was something she would never again be offered. She would never again be offered. She would never again be offered. She would never again be offered.